Nestled deep within the heart of a virtual Yokohama, down an ordinary alley, lies the Sasaki Game Center, a virtual playground celebrating Sega's arcade heritage. Arcades such as this have become a staple of Sega's Like a Dragon series, but with this latest work, we've reached a new milestone. Sega has finally, for the first time, introduced official Model 3 emulation, and with it comes one of the finest racing games ever made. This is Daytona USA 2, now known, thanks to licensing issues, as Sega Racing Classic 2. This arcade-style racing game from the legendary AM2 stands as one of the finest, most elegantly designed racing games of all time, and now we finally have an official home release. But it's not alone. A second Model 3 game is also available with Fighting Vipers 2. This game did receive a conversion to Sega Dreamcast, but how close did it really get? This is my favorite era of 3D graphics, and today I wanted to dig into both these games. We'll discuss the importance of the Model 3 arcade board, what makes Daytona USA 2 such a classic, and even get into comparisons and discussions around the Dreamcast as well. Also, what's up with Daytona USA 3? To understand Sega's Model 3 board, we need to put 1996 into context. This is the year Nintendo 64 arrived on the market, and the year that the PlayStation started to take hold across the industry. This was the year of Tekken 2 and Soul Edge, the year of Quake and Tomb Raider, not to mention Super Mario 64 and Wave Race. On the PC side, the 3DFX Voodoo card arrived on the scene, introducing high-resolution rendering, faster frame rates, and smoother textures. And then there were arcades, and it's here where Sega's AM2 introduced Virtua Fighter 3 to the world. This showcase title was developed alongside the brand new Model 3 arcade hardware, and it immediately felt like a jump into the future. The quality and fluidity of the visuals far exceeded anything else that had ever existed at that point, and it would do so for the next 3 or 4 years. High-resolution 60 frames per second arcade fighting, the Model 3 could push huge polygon counts for the time with high-res textures and actual multi-sampling anti-aliasing. Virtua Fighter 3 itself also introduced inverse kinematics, allowing proper foot placement across uneven surfaces. The entire thing was a visual feast that not only blew the doors off everything else, both at home and in the arcade, but helped define where we would go next. Sega would develop many other games for Model 3, but in 1998 we received the sequel to one of Sega's most beloved games.
Gentlemen, start your engines!
You're off to a rolling start. Good luck!
3, 2, 1, go!
Daytona USA 2 is the quintessential arcade racing experience, marrying ultra high-tech visuals with a tremendous sense of speed and intensity. Even today, decades after its original release, it feels amazing to hop in the cockpit of one of its stock cars and slingshot your way around the track. But to really understand why this game is so beloved, we need to break it down into its individual pieces. It's that combination of visuals, performance, handling, audio, and design that all work hand in hand to create something this memorable. So let's begin with the most eye-popping element, the presentation and its use of the Model 3 hardware. First, we need to look back at 1998, the year Daytona 2 was released, and take a look at what other games were doing during this time frame. There were a wide range of arcade games and home titles released around this time, of course, many of which are fantastic, but it's most interesting to look at the presentation. High-end PCs at this time were delivering games like Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit, which did look remarkable when powered by a 3DFX Voodoo card. Home consoles had their fair share as well, including the 60 frames per second F-Zero X on Nintendo 64. In the arcade, Midway's Rush games were contemporary, although slightly predate Daytona 2, but there's also things like California Speed and others. On the more realistic side, Gran Turismo was released in the West in 1998, redefining expectations for realistic driving on a console. These are all excellent games, but pay attention to those visuals. If we step back 2 years prior, 1996, this is when Sega released Scud Race in the arcade, also on Model 3, and that game delivers visuals like this, running at a super smooth frame rate. This is what I'm talking about, the contrast between what Model 3 was capable of versus what everything else could deliver. And with Daytona 2, Sega moved up to a slightly more powerful version of the Model 3 hardware, and delivered a masterclass in high-end visuals in the process. When you slipped that quarter into the machine and sat down in front of that trusty CRT monitor, it felt like you were dipping your toes into the future of graphics. This is the magic of the arcade, when games were developed on ultra-expensive high-end hardware pushing boundaries at the same time. To put it into perspective, it would be like designing a game that only runs on an RTX 4090 graphics card. If that RTX 4090 graphics card was developed in tandem with the game developers themselves. Which frankly is what makes the AM2 of the 80s and 90s so darn impressive. They were innovating both in terms of technology and game design. So the quality of the visuals comes down to a pairing between exceptionally well-designed artwork, including the textures, colors, lighting, and modeling, in addition to the underlying Model 3 technology. This allowed Sega to push huge polygon counts, millions of polygons per second in fact, while using high-resolution textures with both filtering and mipmaps. The hardware also supports a form of multi-texture known as micro-textures, which can be used to layer in higher detail across textured surfaces. Model 3 supports advanced lighting and color blending features as well. All of this is delivered at a blistering frame rate that never wavers, something we didn't even get from many other arcade racing games of the era. Only Sega and Namco were so focused on hitting this level of performance, but Sega's boards had the advantage in terms of visual features. But how it plays is also critical, of course, and it's here where AM2's excellence really shines through. The handling is perfect, and the sense of speed remains thrilling even today. When you first sit down in front of the cabinet, you'll be scraping the walls and slamming into other cars, but stick with it and you'll slowly begin to master the art of drifting and slipstreaming while improving with each attempt. It's this feeling of refining your skills combined with the speed and presentation that keeps you coming back for more. And of course, the audio is also important, with powerful sound effects combined with a fantastic soundtrack, boasting 2 sets of vocals this time. By default, the game's soundtrack features vocals performed by Dennis St. James, but Sega's legendary Takenobu Mitsuyoshi also returns with his distinct vocal style. The arcade operator could choose between the two.
Show your power, masters feel you wafting. Fumes are burning hot, blood of the car, storming around me. Just hop my eyes, they cool. Tighten on your seatbelt, engine plays are rocking me. Show me what you can do. Engines hot, but I stay cool. Kick the gas to the floor. Engine plays a rocket beat. Show me what you can do. Victory is yours.
Alas, Daytona USA 2 remained in arcades. Despite Dreamcast releasing not long after and the promise of Model 3 ports becoming a reality, it never received a home conversion. There was a Daytona game released for Dreamcast, but it's more of a spin on the original game. As the years passed, hope was lost, and we feared that Daytona 2 may never receive an official home conversion. That is, until now. This fall, Sega finally unveiled its own in-house emulator designed to play Sega Model 3 arcade games. Daytona USA 2 Power Edition, known as Sega Racing Classic 2 of course, is one of the 2 Model 3 games included, and boy is it great to experience this once again. The question here, though, is just how accurate is the emulation? So, according to various interviews, it seems that this internal Model 3 emulator is largely the work of a single programmer who continued to work on this project, eventually enabling its use within Like a Dragon. Unlike prior games, the emulation was not handled by M2. When you fire it up, the first thing you'll notice is that it's still presented in its original 4:3 aspect ratio, but they use a rather subtle CRT filter applied to the entire image with no option to remove it. Compared to the original arcade game running at 496 by 384, this version is rendered at a higher resolution. However, they did not seem to emulate Model 3's anti-aliasing feature, which is likely part of the reason they needed to boost the resolution. Using the game's introduction, however, we can finally draw direct comparisons between the emulated version and real hardware. Thanks to Masked Ninja over on the Supermodel forums, we have genuine capture from a real Model 3 board for comparison. At a glance, the emulated version appears accurate indeed. The microtexture feature is emulated, shadows, lighting, the glare in the car, it's all here. But if you look a little closer, differences do start to manifest. Firstly, the car shading, it's wrong. Let's pause here. Look at the left panel of the Scorpio car. On Model 3, there's this gradual darkening effect along the side of the car that's absent in the Like a Dragon version. And later, when the car flips during the intro, note how, when upside down on Model 3, the body itself appears darkened. No, this isn't due to the crash, rather the way the shading model works. This is absent in the emulated version where it's overly bright. You can see this in other shots as well if you look closely, and it does spill out into the race. It's a minor thing, but an interesting nitpick all the same. I also noticed this: when objects are drawn too near the camera, they appear to be clipped in the emulated version. Look at the spark effect here, it's not drawn quite right. And it's more apparent when the game cuts to the car interior with the driver's hands and the steering wheel clipping right through the camera frustum. It looks rather incorrect. Beyond this, the texture filtering is handled differently. It's vastly superior on real Model 3 hardware, believe it or not, as you can see from this painted line running down the side of the track. So while it's very close and perfectly captures the experience of playing this exceptional game, it is not 100% accurate. I would say it's close enough though that most people won't notice or care, but this is the kind of stuff I find really interesting to explore. Now, one of the other interesting elements is the speed of the presentation. You see, Model 3 games run at 57.524 Hz, and this does not play nicely with modern flat panels or capture cards. The result is judder, as some frames need to be doubled to maintain the speed at 60 Hz. Indeed, during the game's introduction sequence, you can see this exact issue in the emulated version. But what impressed me is that in-game, the actual speed of play is also accurate to the arcade original's 57 Hz, yet there's no visible judder. So they basically figured out how to present the game at a full 60 Hz while retaining the speed of the 57 Hz original. This becomes clear when you bring in the other pseudo-competitor in the Model 3 emulation field, Supermodel. This pioneering piece of software first appeared around 2011 and has continued to evolve since. It's designed to emulate the entirety of the Model 3 back catalog, and in its current state, it happens to be very accurate. Supermodel features both a 57 and 60 Hz output option. The 60 Hz option produces a judder-free experience with just a very slight increase in the game speed. Using the correct 57 Hz option, however, produces minor judder, as I mentioned before. The difference here, though, is that the judder appears during gameplay as well. So by using the 60 Hz mode of Supermodel compared to the Like a Dragon emulated version, we can see that the race clock actually goes out of sync. We know Supermodel's running fast because we're using the 60 Hz mode, but the Sega version actually manages to maintain the correct speed of gameplay. So why do the intro scenes have judder then? Well, I don't know for sure, but I'd imagine this has to do with some specific timing requirements used for those sequences. But I wondered, how does Supermodel stack up against real hardware? It has its own enhancements after all. Well, firstly, the shading problem I mentioned earlier, that's been fixed in Supermodel. Same deal with the clipping issue involving the steering wheel in the hands of the driver. In fact, the only real accuracy issue I noticed in Supermodel, aside from the texture filtering and lack of emulated anti-aliasing, is this. Using the Like a Dragon version, take a look at these beams of light slicing across the sky in the second track. On Supermodel, they appear darkened in comparison. Very strange. Now, while we're talking Supermodel, I also wanted to briefly mention other differences between the official Sega solution and this emulator. Firstly, the controls. This is a game that was built to be played with a steering wheel, of course, and emulating this via analog stick in Supermodel always felt a little bit twitchy compared to using a racing wheel. For the official release, however, there's a sense that these controls were tweaked to reduce this twitchiness when using a gamepad. Using an Xbox pad, I'd say the game now plays better in the Like a Dragon version. Secondly, the audio. This is a tricky one. The original arcade game appears to use some sort of multi-channel 4.1 sound amplifier. Engine and sound effects, for instance, play from the front speakers in the arcade cabinet, while music and the pit crew voiceover play from the rear behind your head, while it seems there's also a subwoofer to add bass. When played in Supermodel, I always found that the pit crew volume is just too low, making it difficult to hear what they're saying. Even if you adjust the music volume and the sound volume separately, these voices are drowned out. But here's the thing, capture from actual Model 3 boards also seems to often exhibit the same problem. Maybe it has something to do with bypassing the amplifier? I'm not entirely sure. For Like a Dragon, however, Sega has done some trickery with the audio implementation, which boosts the volume of the pit crew voices. They sound a little crunchy, sure, but it's a lot more impactful, and it better simulates how it would sound when sitting in a proper arcade cabinet, at least based on my memory of playing it last time. Take a listen.
3, 2, 1, go!
You can take 'em.
My only complaint here is that the Like a Dragon version lacks the Mitsuyoshi versions of the vocal tracks. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other key advantage of Supermodel. It's that it supports high resolutions and widescreen emulation, so you can push these games beyond the original arcade board. It's nifty, but I still prefer using original resolution, so the HUD matches the 3D rendering. Plus, rendering older games at super high resolutions just reveal the flaws in the 3D that are otherwise invisible at the intended resolution. Though perhaps more than most games from this era, Daytona 2 still manages to look great even when running at native 4K. That's just how well crafted these visuals are. Ultimately though, no matter how you play it, Daytona 2/Sega Racing Classic 2 has earned its place in the history books for a reason, with its buttery smooth gameplay, unwavering frame rate, flawless handling, and powerful soundscape. Every time I drop in a quarter, virtual or otherwise, I can't help but smile. This is a game that just brings joy, and I'm appreciative that Sega has finally delivered a proper home console version. I just hope they eventually consider releasing a standalone package of Model 3 games. But playing this again also got me thinking about the Dreamcast game, Daytona USA 2001. I captured some footage for this video and immediately I remembered why it never really clicked. The game just doesn't feel right, but it actually goes deeper than the controls alone. If we place Daytona 2001 side by side with Daytona 2, this kind of becomes a short lesson for designers of racing games everywhere. Check it out. Firstly, Daytona 2 highlights the importance of camera positioning and field of view. Note the angle of the car, the height of the camera, and the car's place within the scene, the way it's all framed. When compared against 2001, the car in Daytona 2 slits closer to the bottom edge of the screen, while the wider field of view helps increase the sense of speed while also visually elongating the car model itself. The basic positioning of these elements is critical to the basic feel of the game. The camera is just too rigid and centered in the Dreamcast game. Furthermore, Daytona 2 also uses the Model 3's micro-texture system to create what I call speed textures. So check it out. If you stop driving in Daytona 2, look at the ground texture. Now, let's get up to full speed, then pause the action. If you compare the two, you might notice that they look rather different. It's the same tarmac surface, but there's something that's changed. I think what they're doing is layering on a different set of textures designed to emphasize speed. The textured lines now move with the trajectory of the camera. It's designed to look fast. Now, the Dreamcast game, no matter how fast you go, the textures never really communicate this sense of forward momentum. They are drawn the same no matter how fast the game is moving. So I believe this, combined with the camera, results in a game that feels a lot slower overall. Daytona 2 also does a better job with shaking and movement of the car model itself. It gives you the impression that the vehicle is being pushed so hard the chassis is being rattled to the core. You don't get that same impression in the Dreamcast version. Couple that with overly sensitive controls and it just doesn't wind up feeling anywhere near as nice as those arcade games. Quite the bummer. While we're on the subject of Dreamcast, however, perhaps it's time to shift over to the other Model 3 game included in Like a Dragon, Fighting Vipers 2. The original Fighting Vipers first arrived in '95 for Sega's Model 2 arcade board, and shortly after received an excellent port to the Sega Saturn. It's a fast-paced fighting game that introduced some unique ideas for the time, including breakable armor and contained areas that could be smashed on victory. The development team would produce Fighters Megamix on the Saturn before moving on to a proper sequel, known of course as Fighting Vipers 2. This time they made use of the Model 3 arcade board, delivering enhanced visuals with significantly more geometry and texture detail. While it never fully matched the visual splendor of Virtua Fighter 3 itself, it was still a handsome game nonetheless. And unlike Daytona USA 2, Fighting Vipers 2 was brought home to the Sega Dreamcast, at least in Japan and Europe. And now, thanks to Like a Dragon Gaiden, the arcade version of Fighting Vipers 2 has come home as well. This is the first time we're seeing the actual Model 3 version of this game on a home machine without compromise. Much like Daytona 2, the sequel to Fighting Vipers operates in a 4:3 aspect ratio with a CRT filter enabled at all times. It also runs at 60 frames per second rather than 57 and delivers fluid motion without judder. Furthermore, the same high-resolution rendering is used here and the whole thing plays pretty well. The one caveat I noticed is that there is a little more input lag than I would have liked on this game. Not something I noticed really with Daytona USA 2, but it is certainly an issue here. One thing to note though, I did not have access to direct capture from a real Fighting Vipers 2 board, and in fact I've never played the actual arcade game myself, so I cannot judge this to the same standard as Daytona 2. What we can do, however, is compare with the Sega Dreamcast version. Now, I'd always assumed the Dreamcast version was more or less arcade accurate. In fact, it had a reputation for being better than the disappointing Dreamcast port of Virtua Fighter 3 TB. But after sampling the game myself via Like a Dragon, it turns out there are actually a lot of missing details in the Dreamcast version. For starters, the geometry is pared back. The Dreamcast game features less complex arenas and subtle changes to the characters and effects. Check out this area for instance. The floor boasts a fully modeled 3D grate on Model 3, but the Dreamcast version uses a low-resolution texture instead. Furthermore, the background scenery lacks the flickering glow from the raging fire, and Bond's coat-tail physics are certainly less convincing as well. In the next stage, check out the difference in the floor. Textures are higher resolution on Model 3, and the shadow is drawn completely differently. Furthermore, background texture work is much lower res on Dreamcast as well. We see the same in this area. Check out the textures across the ceiling behind the life bars. Or how about this arena? We have modeled polygon grate floors on the Model 3, whereas Dreamcast uses alpha textures instead. Basically, across the game, I noticed a drop in texture and geometry detail. Certain effects are also rendered differently, such as these spotlight cones from the intro, or this explosion in this scene. That's not to say the Dreamcast port is bad. In fact, for the time, I'd say it's pretty darn good. I was just surprised to see the areas where it falls short, considering the reputation it had for being nearly arcade perfect. But Fighting Vipers 2 really is kind of a weird one overall. It's a fun game, but it's not among my favorite Sega arcade titles from this era. I do, however, appreciate seeing it preserved here within Like a Dragon, and as with Daytona 2, the emulation seems to be very good. But the re-emergence of arcades as these virtual play spaces in modern games really got me thinking about real-life arcades as well. In Western countries, arcades have changed significantly, often housing more retro games than anything new. Pay a flat fee, come on in, and enjoy the games. I do love that, but in many Asian countries, more traditional arcades are still alive and well. But the development and release of games in arcades has changed a lot. These machines are typically networked together or contain multiple games on a single unit. But many of the same companies from back in the day are still around to one degree or another. And this is where companies like Sega Amusements comes in. They've developed numerous titles using Sega properties over the years, and one of those games is Daytona USA 3. Well, at one point it was known as Daytona 3, it is now known as Daytona Championship USA. And this one is very interesting to me. Released roughly around 2017, this new version of Daytona features brand new updated visuals, new tracks, and remastered classic tracks, plus a whole new modern cabinet. The idea is to recreate the original Daytona experience for a new audience while polishing up the visuals, and honestly, I think it works. The bold colors and visual enhancements very much feel in line with the Lindbergh era of Sega arcade games, with more modern visual techniques at play, yet retaining that stylized look. But I always wanted to see how it compared to the 1993 original, given that they are so closely related, so I've put together this side-by-side gallery showcasing exactly that. And as you can see, it definitely does seem to share the underlying physics and control systems of that original game, which also makes it easy to keep the two in full alignment. The new game boasts more realistic colors than the original's primary hues, but I still feel that it retains that vibrant look. It strikes a nice balance between realism and exaggerated style. Obviously, things like shadow maps are now available, not to mention realistic reflections generated by probes combined with cube maps. The cars, of course, feature more polygons, though the camera positioning and FOV do feel slightly different for sure. The trees and other foliage are now fully modeled, and even Sonic's iconic figure carved into the side of the mountain has now been fully modeled. And when you finish a race, you're treated to an identical victory sequence, save for the addition of credits, which reveals the staff to be a rather international crowd this time around. Next up then is the Seaside Street Galaxy. Much like the prior track, the color scheme has shifted away from the bold primaries of the original game. The skies are still very much blue, but a different shade of blue. World geometry has been expanded, and Jeffrey's infamous hopping statue has been replaced with Akira. The rest of the track features the expected improvements, including boosted world geometry and higher resolution textures, on top of all those modern rendering features I already mentioned. This continues in Dinosaur Canyon, of course, though the tone of the lighting has changed once more. It's interesting to see how the developers have approached this project, and I feel overall they've done a great job at capturing the flavor of Daytona with a modern flair. But did you know that Sega mistakenly released this game for download for free several years ago? That's right, Daytona Championship runs on PC hardware, much like most modern arcade games, and these games are regularly updated over the internet. Sega Amusements released an update package for the game that was unprotected and contained the entire game. It was just put out there on their website for download, and that version happens to run well on any PC. Whoops. Given this though, I'm pretty disappointed that Sega has not opted to release an official home console version of the game. After all, it feels true to the series' roots, with an aesthetic that is a natural progression of the Daytona USA look. Sure, I still prefer the second game, but I think this final entry in the series is extremely enjoyable. And I think it could have found a home audience as well, considering it doesn't exactly have super wide distribution. Alas, as of today, it remains an arcade exclusive, at least technically. With that, however, we're back in the modern era. I've often lamented the slow disappearance of the arcade racer, but the re-emergence of Daytona USA, at least in some form, does at least give me a glimmer of hope. Someone deep within Sega still clearly cares. In Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man who erased his name as it's known, Sega has opted to do exactly the opposite for its Model 3 board. The name Model 3 has been revived, and they are finally honoring its legacy. The emulation is not flawless, but it's good enough, and it sets the stage for future releases. Couple this with the recent announcement of Virtua Fighter 3 TB making a return to Japanese arcades, and it seems that perhaps Sega is finally ready to thrust open the doors of history once again. I have no idea what the future may hold for Sega and its stable of games. Will Scud Race finally come home in a future Like a Dragon title? Will a standalone collection of Model 3 games ever make an appearance? Does Sega Amusements have any additional racing games planned? We cannot say for sure, but for the first time in years, there is a glimmer of hope.